We begin, as we so often do, with a piece of land that everyone else had given up on. The parcel sat at the fork where Salt Creek bent hard against a ridge of red shale, 60 acres of scrub grass and broken fence line that the county had listed 3 times and sold only once for $11. At a tax auction, nobody attended but a woman in a gray traveling coat who signed her name as Confidence Whitlow and did not blink when the clerk asked her to repeat it. We remember that winter as the coldest in a decade. We remember, too, that nobody in town could say why a woman traveling alone, with no husband's name to vouch for her and no family sending letters, would want 60 acres that the last 3 owners had walked away from without looking back. The soil was said to be poisoned by an old mine tailing upstream. The well was said to run dry by July. The house, if it could be called that, had lost half its roof to a windstorm 2 summers past, and nobody had bothered fixing it since. Confidence bought it anyway, paid in coin, and rode out to it the same afternoon with a mule, a crate of tools, and a resolve that the men at the land office found first amusing, then unsettling, then simply impossible to explain away. We tell you this because it matters what kind of woman she was before the trouble came. She was not desperate. She was not naive. She had come from Ohio with a small inheritance and a smaller patience for being told what a woman could or couldn't manage alone. And she had looked at that broken roofed house and seen not what it was, but what the creek bend told her it could be. The way the water pooled deep and slow just past the ridge, the way the grass grew thick and green in a stripe no drought seemed to touch. She did not know yet what that stripe of green meant. She only knew enough to trust it. By the second week, she had patched the roof herself, badly, with lumber hauled from a collapsed barn 3 miles off. By the third, she had cleared enough brush to plant a kitchen garden, though the season was already late for it. The town watched from a distance, the way towns do, some with curiosity, some with a particular scorn reserved for a woman who did not need their permission to try. What none of them knew, what Confidence herself did not yet fully grasp, was that the Northern Frontier Rail Company had spent the better part of a year quietly buying up the parcels along Salt Creek, one by one, for reasons they kept close and unspoken. Surveyors had passed through twice already, taking measurements they didn't explain, marking stakes they didn't account for. The company's man in the territory, a clipped and careful accountant named Foss, had a map in his office with every parcel along that creek shaded in, save one, hers. And so, in a rented office, 3 towns over, a decision was made that would have seemed, at the time, like nothing more than ordinary business. A telegram was sent, a name was written down, a man was hired to go make the trouble go away, quietly, the way such things were usually made to go away. The man's name was Barnabas Coe. We will come to know him soon enough. But first, we ask you to sit a while longer with Confidence, alone on that ridge, patching a roof she did not yet know was about to be tested by far more than weather. Barnabas Coe had built a reputation the way most men in his trade did, quietly, and through work nobody wanted to look at too closely. He was not, we should say plainly, a violent man. He had never once drawn a gun on a soul who hadn't drawn first, and even then, only twice in a life that had taken him through half the territories west of the Mississippi. What he was, instead, was patient and thorough, and possessed of a particular gift for making people leave land without ever laying a hand on them, through paperwork, through pressure, through the slow tightening of circumstance until walking away seemed like the only sensible choice left. The railroad paid him well for that gift. He had cleared 4 parcels for them already that year, and in each case the owners had left with money in their pockets and no particular grievance, which was, in his mind, the mark of a job done properly. He told himself, as he rode toward Salt Creek with Foss's letter folded in his coat, that this parcel would be no different. A widow, or a spinster, or whatever she was alone on land she couldn't possibly hold, would see reason quickly enough once the numbers were laid plain in front of her. He did not expect to find the roof already patched. He came upon the property in the late afternoon, the light low and gold across the ridge, and the first thing he saw was not a desperate woman waiting to be reasoned with, but a garden turned fresh in dark soil, fence posts reset in neat lines, and smoke rising steady from a chimney that had, by every account he'd been given, not drawn smoke in over a year. Confidence saw him before he reached the gate. She did not startle. She set down the hoe she'd been working with, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited for him to say his piece the way a woman waits for weather she already knows is coming. "Name's Barnabas Coe," he said. "I've come on behalf of the Northern Frontier Rail Company." "Have you?" she said. Not a question. He explained it the way he always did, plainly, without threat, laying out a fair price for land that everyone agreed was more trouble than it was worth, a chance to walk away with money in hand rather than fight a company with more lawyers than the whole territory had judges. He watched her face for the flicker he usually saw at this point, the moment a person's resolve began to soften under the weight of a number written on paper. It did not come. "This is my land, Mr. Coe," she said. "Bought and paid for, clean, in front of witnesses who'll still be standing here when the railroad's business is done and gone. I don't believe I'll be selling it to a company that sent a man out here before they ever bothered sending an honest offer to my door." He rode back to town that evening, turning something over in his mind that he did not have a word for, yet not quite admiration, not quite unease, but something close to both. The recognition of a person who was not going to make his job the simple thing he'd assumed it would be. He wrote to Foss that night. "Owner is uncooperative but reasonable. Will require more time." He did not write the rest of what he was thinking because he was not yet sure himself what it meant. "We wish we could tell you the railroad let the matter rest after that first visit. It did not." Within the week, Confidence found her credit line at the general store abruptly closed on instruction, the shopkeeper admitted uneasily, from parties he did not care to name. A week after that, the man who had agreed to haul her lumber found himself suddenly too busy to make the trip, and the one after him, too, until she understood that the railroad's reach in that county was longer and quieter than she had first accounted for. She did not weep over it. We want to be honest with you about that, because Confidence was not a woman given to weeping where trouble could be met instead with work. She hitched the mule herself and hauled her own lumber the 11 miles from the next town over, twice, though it cost her 3 days she could not spare with planting season closing in. It was on the second of those trips that Barnabas found her again, not by design, he would insist later, though we suspect some part of him had gone looking for the road she'd be on. Her wagon wheel had split on the rocky grade half a mile from her gate, lumber scattered across the track, and she was crouched beside it in the dust working a problem that had no easy solution when he came around the bend and reined in without being asked. "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Coe." "Didn't say you did," he said, already climbing down. Man can fix a wheel without it meaning a thing. She watched him a long moment, weighing, we imagine, whether his help came with a price attached that she hadn't yet been told. But he worked in silence, competent and unhurried, and said nothing of the railroad, nothing of the offer, nothing at all beyond the occasional word about the wheel itself, until the job was done and the wagon stood steady again. "Why," she asked finally, "would the man sent to run me off help me haul my own lumber?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "Reckon a job's a job," he said, "but I've never yet been asked to be unkind while I did it." It was not an answer that settled anything between them, but it was, we think, the first small crack in something that had seemed, up to that point, entirely settled his purpose. Her resistance, the clean and simple lines the railroad had drawn between them. He rode back to town that night without mentioning the wheel in his letter to Foss. It was a small omission. It would not be his last. Confidence, for her part, said nothing of it to anyone either, not because she was ashamed of accepting help, but because she had not yet found the words for what she'd felt, watching a man paid to enter do instead the quiet, unasked-for work of a neighbor. We told you earlier of the stripe of green grass that ran along the creek bend, thick and unbothered by the drought that had browned every other field in the county. Confidence had trusted it without understanding it. In the 4th week, she came to understand it fully. She was widening the garden plot when her spade struck something harder than root or rock, and what came up out of the black soil was not stone at all, but a vein of ore, dark and heavy in her palm, the kind of find that men in that territory had built fortunes chasing and just as often ruined themselves failing to find. She did not know enough of mining to name it precisely, but she knew enough of value to understand, at once, why a railroad company might want 60 acres that everyone else had called worthless. It was not the rail line they wanted through her land. It had never been the rail line at all. The surveys, the quiet buying up of parcels along the creek, the pressure applied so precisely and so fast, all of it made sense now, arranged around a truth the company had never intended to say plainly to the one owner who stood in the way of it. She did not run to town with the news. She did not run to Barnabas either, though she thought, longer than she meant to, about whether she ought to trust him with it. Instead, she wrapped the ore in a cloth, buried it back beneath a floorboard in the house, and sat a long while at her table turning over what she now understood, that she was not fighting a company that wanted worthless land off its books. She was fighting a company that knew exactly what her land was worth and intended to have it for $11 if it could manage the trick. When Barnabas came again, this time with no pretense of accident, riding out simply because he found he wanted to see how her wheel was holding, she watched him with new and careful eyes, weighing what she now carried alone against what she might risk in trusting him with it. "You've the look of a woman holding something back," he said. "I've the look of a woman who's learned what her own land is worth," she said, "and isn't fool enough to say it out loud to a man still drawing pay from the folks trying to take it." He did not deny that he still drew that pay. We respect him for that. If nothing else, he had never once lied to her, not about his purpose nor his employer, even as the shape of his loyalty had begun, unmistakably, to shift. "I'll not pretend Foss doesn't sign my wages," he said, "but I'll tell you plain, Miss Whitlow, whatever's under this ground of yours, it's yours by every law this territory recognizes, and I've grown tired of jobs that ask me to forget that." It was the closest he had come to declaring himself, and neither of them spoke further of it that day. But something had been set in motion that the railroad, for all its maps and telegrams, had not accounted for at all. Foss's patience, back at the company office, had begun to thin. 3 letters arrived that month, demanding to know why Coe had not yet closed the matter, why a job that should have taken a fortnight had stretched into 2 months with nothing to show for it but vague reports of a stubborn but reasonable owner. The final letter carried an instruction Barnabas read twice before he let himself understand it fully: authorization to escalate, to have the county surveyor quietly misfile her deed, to raise a legal challenge to the original tax sale, to make the woman's claim to the land disappear on paper rather than in person. It was the kind of instruction that men in his trade were meant to carry out without asking too many questions of it. Barnabas found, sitting alone in the boarding house that evening with the letter in front of him, that he could not make himself write the reply that would have set the scheme in motion. He thought of the wheel he'd fixed on the rocky grade. He thought of the roof she'd patched herself before he'd ever ridden out to trouble her. He thought, too, of every parcel he'd cleared before hers, and wondered, for the first time in a long career of not wondering, how many of those owners had walked away not because the offer was fair, but because men like him had made staying feel impossible. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning, he rode out to Salt Creek instead of to the telegraph office. "They mean to steal the deed out from under you," he told her plainly, laying Foss's letter on her table without ceremony. "Not buy you out. Steal it, misfile it, challenge it, bury your claim in paper until you can't prove what you already own. Confidence." Read the letter twice, her face unreadable, and then looked up at him with a question that carried more weight than its words let on. "And you've brought me this instead of doing as you're told." "I have. Why?" He did not answer quickly, and when he did, it was with the plain honesty that had, we think, been the truest thing about him since the day he'd first ridden onto her land. "Because I've spent longer in this trade than I care to admit, doing jobs I told myself were simple business, and I find I can't make myself do this one. Not to you. Not after watching you build something out of ground everyone else called dead. It was not a declaration of love, not yet we would be getting ahead of ourselves to call it that, but it was a declaration of something, a man choosing, plainly and at real cost to himself, to stand against the very company that paid him, for the sake of a woman who had never once asked him to." Confidence folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Then we'd best see what can be done about a deed they mean to steal," she said, "before they find another man, less troubled by his conscience, to finish what you won't. We have found, in every story we've told you from this territory, that the truth has a way of surviving in paper even when men try their hardest to bury it. This was no exception. Confidence rode to the county seat herself, 3 days there and back, and sat across from a records clerk named Mrs. Abernathy, who had, we should say, no particular love for the railroad after watching it swallow 2 of her own late husband's parcels years before. Together they pulled the original tax sale ledger, the witnessed bill of sale, and the surveyor's marks from the auction day itself. Every document Confidence would need to prove, plainly and beyond challenge, that her claim to the land had never been anything but clean. Barnabas, for his part, did what he could from the other side of the ledger. He rode to the 2 other parcel owners the railroad had already cleared that year, men who had taken the company's money and left quietly, and asked them, carefully, whether they'd been told the full truth of what lay beneath their land before they signed it away. Neither had. One, a widower named Pruitt, grew so incensed at the asking that he agreed, on the spot, to put his account in writing. It was slow work and dangerous in its way. Foss was not a man who took kindly to being crossed, and word reached him soon enough that his own hired man was riding the county, gathering testimony against the very company that paid him. The letter that came for Barnabas after that was not a request. It was a dismissal, effective immediately, with a warning attached that made plain the railroad did not intend to let the matter of Salt Creek go quietly, deed or no deed. Barnabas read the dismissal at Confidence's kitchen table, the same table where he'd once laid down Foss's first letter. "They've cut you loose," she said. "They have, and left you with nothing to show for standing against them." He looked at her a long moment, the roof she'd patched, the garden she'd grown from dead ground, the woman who had built something lasting out of a piece of land nobody else had wanted, including, once, him. "I've more to show for it than you'd. Think, Miss Whitlow," he said, "I've a clean conscience for the first time in longer than I care to say. I've your trust, if I've earned it, and I find those weigh heavier to me now than any wage the railroad ever paid." She did not answer him in words. She poured him coffee instead, the way she might for a neighbor who'd stayed to see a hard job through, and let the silence between them say what neither was yet ready to put plainly into speech. Outside, the stripe of green along the creek bend held steady against the dry summer, patient as the 2 of them had learned, slowly and against every expectation either had carried into that first meeting at the gate, to be patient with each other. The railroad's challenge to Confidence's deed came before the circuit judge on a bright morning in late August, and we tell you now, plainly, that the outcome was never so uncertain as the company's lawyers believed it to be. Foss himself made the trip, a rare thing for a man who preferred his business handled at a safe remove, and we suspect he came only because he had not yet learned to expect defeat and wished to see for himself how such an inconvenience might still be salvaged. He brought with him a surveyor prepared to testify that the original auction notice had been improperly posted, a claim built on nothing sturdier than the hope that no one still living would remember otherwise. Mrs. Abernathy remembered otherwise. She testified, ledger in hand, that the notice had been posted exactly as the law required, on the courthouse door and in the county paper both, and that she herself had witnessed Confidence Whitlow's payment in full coin on the day in question. Pruitt testified next, plainly and without flourish, about the offer he'd accepted from the railroad and the truth about the land's value that had never once been mentioned to him before he signed. And then Barnabas was called. We imagine Foss believed, even then, that his former man might yet find some way to soften his account, some old loyalty to the company that had paid him for years reasserting itself under oath. It did not. Barnabas testified plainly to every instruction he had been given, the pressure applied to her credit, the lumber haulers turned away, the final letter authorizing the deed to be quietly buried in paper, and did not once flinch from naming the company that had signed his wages for the better part of a decade. "You've thrown away a career to say this," the railroad's lawyer said to him, more accusation than question. "I've thrown away nothing I valued keeping," Barnabas answered. "A man's wages don't amount to much once he can't stand what he's done to earn them." The judge did not take long to decide. The original sale was upheld as clean and lawful. The railroad's challenge was dismissed outright, with a rebuke on the record for the conduct that had preceded it. Confidence Whitlow's claim to her 60 acres ore vein, creek bend, broken-roofed house, and all stood exactly as it had the day she'd signed her name at auction. Foss left the courthouse without a word to either of them, and we understand, from what later reached the town, that the Northern Frontier Rail Company quietly abandoned its interest in Salt Creek altogether rather than risk a second public airing of how it had conducted itself. Whatever plans it had once drawn for that stripe of green along the water, they were never spoken of in that territory again. Confidence stood outside the courthouse in the sun, the weight of 2 months lifted at last, and turned to the man beside her, a man who had ridden out once to drive her off her own land, and had instead given up his wages, his employer, and his old certainty about what his work was worth to see her keep it. "You came here to run me out, mister." "Coe," she said. "I did," he said. "Turned out to be the worst job I ever took, and the one I'm least sorry for. We have told you, in other stories from this territory, that the women we speak of do not keep good fortune to themselves once it arrives. Confidence was no exception. She did not sell the ore to the highest bidder from some distant city, though offers came quickly enough once word of the hearing spread. She sold instead, in careful portions, to a small mining concern out of the county seat, one willing to hire local men at a fair wage rather than import labor from elsewhere, and use the proceeds first to rebuild the roof properly, then to dig the well twice as deep as before. So it would never run dry again regardless of season. What she did after that is the part of the story the town still tells, we're told, on quiet evenings when the subject of Salt Creek comes up. She set aside a portion of the land nearest the road, the driest and least valuable acreage she owned, and offered it free to any family in the county who had lost their own parcel to the railroad's earlier dealings. Pruitt among the first to take her up on it, building a small house not 200 yards from her own. It was not charity exactly, and she would have bristled at the word. It was closer, we think, to a kind of restitution, a recognition that the ground she'd been lucky and stubborn enough to keep might do more good shared than hoarded, and that the company which had once tried to take everything from her had, in trying, left behind a debt that only she was now positioned to repay. Barnabas stayed on through all of it, first as little more than an extra pair of hands rebuilding what the railroad's pressure had let fall into disrepair, then as something the town had begun, without much surprise, to simply expect. He took no wage from her for the work. When she offered one, plainly, across the same kitchen table where so much of their trouble had first been laid out, he shook his head. "I've had my fill of wages that asked more of me than they were worth," he said. "I'd rather earn my place here plainly, if you'll have me." She did not answer that day either, not fully. But we think she had already answered it, in every small way that mattered, from the afternoon she'd let him fix a wagon wheel she hadn't asked him to touch. The winter that came after was nothing like the one before it. Where the first winter Confidence had spent alone on that ridge had been a matter of survival, patched roof, thin coin, a house that groaned against every wind that found it. The second was something closer to a season of quiet building. The well held steady through the cold months for the first time in years. The new family settled on the land she'd shared were raising their own roofs before the snow came heavy, and more than one evening found half the ridge gathered at Confidence's table, the kind of full and easy company that the property had not known in longer than anyone could say. Barnabas built himself a small cabin of his own near the tree line, close enough to be within call, far enough to leave no question of impropriety, in a town that still, in its way, watched the two of them closely. He worked the land alongside her through every season that followed, and if the town noticed how often his cabin sat empty on cold nights while lamplight burned late in her kitchen window, it kept, by and large, a respectful and knowing silence about it. It was Pruitt, in fact, who finally said what neither of them had gotten around to saying themselves at a gathering the following spring meant to celebrate the first planting on the shared acreage. "Man doesn't give up a career and a wage for a woman he doesn't mean to marry," he said, plainly, in front of half the ridge, and looked between the two of them until Confidence laughed despite herself and Barnabas found, for once, no ready answer at all. They married that summer, quietly, at the same courthouse where the deed had once been contested, with Mrs. Abernathy standing as witness and Pruitt's whole family filling out the modest gathering that followed. Confidence wore a dress she'd sewn herself from cloth, bought with money the land itself had finally, honestly, provided. Barnabas stood beside her in the same coat he'd worn the day he first came to drive her off it. Kept all this time, he admitted later, because he'd never found a reason good enough to replace it. We tell you this not because every story needs a wedding to call itself finished, but because this one, we think, earned its ending honestly through work and testimony and the slow, unglamorous business of two people choosing again and again to trust each other a little further than the last time. The land along Salt Creek is still worked today by families who trace their claim back to that shared acreage, and the stripe of green along the water still runs thick and unbothered by drought the way it always had, long before anyone understood what it meant. We think often, in telling these stories, about the difference between what a piece of land is worth on paper and what it becomes in the hands of someone willing to stay and work it honestly. Confidence Whitlow was told more than once that her 60 acres were worthless, poisoned soil, a dry well, a broken roof nobody thought fit to fix. She looked past every one of those verdicts and found, in a stripe of green grass by a creek bend, a truth the whole county had missed. And we think too about Barnabas Coe, a man sent to finish a piece of ordinary business who found instead that he could not make peace with the cost of doing it. It would have been easier, we imagine, for him to write the letter Foss wanted, collect his wage, and ride on to the next parcel with a clear conscience bought cheap. He chose instead the harder and more honest road one that cost him a career before it gave him a home. There is a kind of quiet justice in how this one resolved. The company that tried to bury a woman's claim in paperwork found itself undone by the very paper trail it left behind. The man hired to drive her out became the one who stayed to build beside her, and the land nobody wanted became the ground on which an entire ridge of families found their footing again. We do not tell you this story to say that every hardship hides a fortune beneath it, or that every hired man sent against you is secretly a friend in waiting. We tell it because Confidence and Barnabas remind us of something simpler and, we think, truer, that the measure of a person is rarely found in the job they were given, but in what they choose to do when that job asks something of them they can no longer, in good conscience, provide. If this story found you tonight, we hope it finds you patient with your own hard ground, whatever shape that ground takes in your life, trusting, as Confidence did, that what looks like nothing may yet prove to be everything, given time, given care, and given the right hands willing to stay and tend it. We'll see you in the next one.